Hello there. Just putting down a few thoughts here about some things. Uh, I know a lot of people still, friends and contacts, but actual friends who you, you could probably say really fit the picture of modern liberals. And it's it's quite sort of like bizarre nowadays talking to these people for me. And these people that you know, they're friends. I love them, and or I'm on good personal relationships with them. Uh, but when it comes to anything to do with politics or social things in this way that might be taken to be political, they are always bringing up subjects and then trying to sort of like broadcast this to you, um, that this is of course how reasonable people should be, and basically when you answer back on the subject that they themselves have brought up, they tend to either get angry or else they'll say, well, I don't know about that, and then they'll just retreat into something, and they're the ones that are bringing up politics. um, for me, politics is absolute garbage compared to human relationships. The whole lot of it, and but the fact is, it's there. It's part of human life. So of course you're going to have opinions about it, and you would have choices, given choices, because that's how our societies run. Um, and it's kind of quite difficult, really, because I it's just very odd dealing with people who appear to be so very irrational and yet consider themselves to be holding the only possible reasonable and moral view. You know, um, it's kind of right, pretty weird. Um, how you deal with that, and why are people like that? You're kind of gonna wonder about this, because I'm not talking about people who are like 20. Um, I I've I spent most of my life being what I would consider a leftist. You know, I grew up with that stuff. Um, I believed in all of that stuff. Yeah, and because of that, I've watched it over the years. I got to know about it. Yeah, I got to see it. Um, I was more of a leftist than these people are. I was more actively a leftist than these people are. Yeah. And yet these people now, they're the standard bearers of this stuff. Which is kind of funny. I didn't see you on the demonstrations in the old days. Um, but they suddenly, as far as they're concerned, they know better. They absolutely know better. And it's like, well, that's fine. I don't even want to change their minds. I don't talk to somebody in order to change their mind. You talk to somebody in order to talk to somebody. And a good deal of that is going to be listening, as far as there's something that you can find to listen to. Um, but it's just strange how things work out. You know, I spent most of my life thinking that I was a leftist, but I came to question it because I actually believed in the things I was talking about and thought about them. And I was noticing discrepancies, and I was noticing things that didn't make sense and that didn't add up. And there comes a point at which you think, I've got to look into this. And then I think that probably is the difference between me and these people. We've just had a different approach to life and a different approach to our what we found to be the predicament of a living with people and in a society. And I think the thing is, I've taken my position as an individual. No matter how much I was encouraged by what I was learning and by what I'd been programmed with through the counterculture of the 70s and all sorts of things. No matter how much I was programmed to identify as a tribe, which is exactly how the left tends to work, to identify as a tribe. No matter how much I was encouraged to do that, I was always someone who would end up on the outside somehow. I was just non-insider by instinct in that way, for whatever reason. And so after a while, what you do is you try and find the higher ground. I'm not talking about moral high grounds and all that shit, you know. You try and find the higher ground, metaphorically, from which you could survey the landscape and try and see, how did we get to this place? What led here? And you start looking into things. And you start asking questions, and you start adding up the pattern from that perspective. Whereas I think a lot of people nowadays who identify as liberals, they don't do that. They're down in the undergrowth, basically, and all they've got to go on is the reports, basically, of the media, and of a particular kind of social consensus. They haven't been able to break rank, you know. They haven't been able to look at things in that way. And that actually started for me probably in my 30s, I think. I think that started for me in my 30s. And for instance, I was really, you know, you go through all sorts of things. I went through all sorts of crises in my life. And you try and find the way through. And I was always very interested in the counterculture of the 60s because it was so formative for me. I grew up in the 1960s because I was born in the late 50s, yeah. And I would try and find, well, what's the thing about the counterculture of the 60s which was positive, and where did it go off the rails? Because, you know, it was very obvious to everyone who was living through that time that by about 1975, something had run into the sludge, you know. It was very, very clear. And I was trying to look back on these things and trying to untangle the threads from the 1960s, for instance, and I could see that the positive stuff was an opening up to a search for spirituality, and the negative was the political activism. The negative was the politics. That's what dragged things down into a obsession with power. And as far as I was concerned, that was what did it. That was the start. But the other things was I would look at things, for instance, like the behavior of feminism, which had been one of the sort of absolute mainstays of our moral universe, you know, along with Marxism, basically. And looking at that and looking at the double standards and the hypocrisies when you start to look at human beings. Because I'd grown up thinking, well, okay, I'm male, but I want to fight for justice, for equality, for all these sorts of things. And then I saw that people who said they wanted equality actually didn't. In fact, there was very definite double standards. And I looked at the way that people in the new left would avoid issues and avoid criticism of certain things, and the way that they would always seek to justify other things. And I saw that it had nothing to do with anything that was actually ethical. That's the thing. Because what had happened is that we had been bamboozled into imagining that politics was the real road to ethics. And that is a very, very dangerous proposition and a very destructive proposition. Yeah. And I've seen that sort of like play out since then. Now, as I said in the previous video, I think a lot of things that are happening now are a certain sort of like crunch point in the boomers getting near to the point of dying out. So the baby boomer radicals have like really, really doubled down on trying to um, get somebody to live their so-called revolution for them, and they see the millennials as their kind of cannon fodder. Really, I find that pretty disgusting, but that's par for the course, really. Um, Now, the funny thing is, nowadays, I could talk to an old fashioned liberal and find a lot to agree on. And I could talk to an old fashioned leftist and find a lot to disagree on, but I could talk to them because we'd know what we were talking about. But talking to a modern liberal is almost impossible because it's simply an emotional orientation which has come out of a sense of, which has come out of a kind of intellectual confusion and an ethical incoherence. And you look at the way that they see things, it's highly tribal, yeah? It's tribal, it's insecure, uh, it's emotional, it's incoherent, largely, and it's all very, very short-term thinking. And as I was saying, you try and get to higher ground to try and see how we got here, and you start to see the patterns, and well, what happened where and when. And what the people stuck in the undergrowth don't see, I think, is the way that philosophies and ideas that are not good ideas actually can undermine culture and undermine ethics and undermine clarity of thought. In fact, undermine the thinking process and degrade it, just as, for instance, we undermine and degrade our sense of what being men and women in the bodies we have is, for instance. Quite fundamental things. They don't see how that stuff happens. So they think that when you are objecting to things, you've got a conspiracy theory. It's not a conspiracy theory. You're just looking at phenomena, basically. You don't need a conspiracy to see what is basically a decay and a a, a breakdown. What's happened, I think, is that a lot of very destructive ideas coming out of, coming out of the defeat of old style Marxism, going into postmodern theories, which have which are very easy to get embedded in things like academia and policy making. That combined with the influence of the media, it has almost like a sort of like a viral effect. Now, is that virus, is that mental virus a conspiracy? No, no, that it's not. You do have certainly people who want to push things, and I think they're very, very deluded and stuck in a kind of like a mental warp. But these things don't need to be conspiracies. But it's funny how liberals think that anybody who's critical of them is basically a conspiracy theorist. Anybody who's critical of their ideas is a conspiracy theorist. And they just think, what are they doing? I've had liberals say to me that, they don't care about democracy. We just want to be ruled by a bureaucracy that essentially by a bureaucracy that they trust, you know. And I've had people say that they think that, people should be denied medical treatment if they, for instance, choose not to have a certain vaccine or what have you. And it's a sad fact. Utopians, if you take utopianism, which could be a spiritual thing, yeah, it could be a spiritual thing. A lot of spiritualities have a sort of utopian side to them, They want this beautiful world quite often, you know. Now, if your way of achieving utopia is political, it's almost inevitable that you will tend towards totalitarianism. Because if it becomes enough of an issue for you that you have to establish utopia, otherwise disaster, and your means of establishing that are political, it follows its own very simple reductive logic at a certain level that you have to then excuse further and further erosions of freedom, because those freedoms get in the way of the establishment of utopia through political means. It should be obvious to anybody that that's the exact opposite of any liberal philosophy. It should be obvious that that is the exact opposite of liberalism. But what's being propagated is not liberalism. It's not liberalism. It's not even old-fashioned leftism. It's this Frankenstein. It's this Frankenstein merging, which is neither. And it's based upon a destruction of clear thought, a destruction of meaning, and an authoritarian obsession with power, which is then merged with emotional identification. And it does get to resemble a cult, really. I don't know what you can do about this, really, apart from simply continue to think clearly yourself. Continue to try and look for answers. Don't interfere with people. Go your own way. Find those that are interested in looking into the same things to try and increase understanding of what our situation is, what our predicament is, how we got here, what we've lost, and what we can keep hold of. That's why, at this point, so many things look like conservatism that are actually old-style liberalism, in fact. The conformists and the authoritarians now call themselves liberals, and the people looking for clarity inevitably become the heretics in what has become a very a dominant paradigm of an elite section or level of society. It's no point saying it's a sad predicament, really. It's a predicament that needs to be studied and needs to be observed. And, well, we just have to live our lives as best we can. But if I was to say to anybody, what would really help? Well, look into actual moral philosophy. Look into ethics. Look into philosophy of thought, yeah? Look into it. Look into what clear thinking actually is. Look into what a thought process is. Because a thought process that has to be regulated, censored, or guided to what you would prefer as an outcome is not a thought process. And that's the unfortunate thing. We live in a time where, since the 1960s, we've had this anything goes and anything is okay type attitude towards any form of thinking. Any sort of mental activity is considered to be thinking. That is not the case. The sobering reality is that thinking is a work which has to be engaged in as a personal discipline, and that we achieve thought. We don't just think. And I think that's probably one of the really key things. And from that comes the sense, and from that comes the sense of things like virtue and the things that people can base good lives upon. Anyway, those are my thoughts for today.